Impatient stepmother shaves stepdaughter's hair against her will after the girl says, "Can you help me? My head is itching." But when the father arrives, he does this. Barbara was an 11-year-old girl with a wisdom that seemed to have been accumulated over many more years than she had lived. There was something in her calm gaze, in her patient gestures, that revealed an early understanding of the world around her. Since the loss of her mother, the girl had learned to face life with a resilience that often went unnoticed by the adults around her. It was not only her ability to accept the changes that came after her mother's death, but also her determination to adjust to them without complaints or resentment. Living with Elizabeth, her stepmother, was marked by a lack of affection. Elizabeth was not cruel, but she also made no effort to offer Barbara anything beyond the bare minimum. She prepared the meals, washed the girls' clothes, and kept her room tidy, but she did all of this with a coldness that seemed to exclude any possibility of closeness. Barbara, however, did not let it get to her. She recognized that Elizabeth was fulfilling these duties, and that was enough for her. She did not expect affection or tender gestures. It was enough that the house continued to function and that the balance was maintained. Gary, her father, was a dedicated man who carried the weight of two responsibilities: supporting the family and taking care of Barbara. He worked long hours, often exhausted, but never failed to smile when he saw his daughter at the end of the day. Barbara admired her father's effort and did her best not to burden him with her own pains or annoyances. Since Elizabeth had arrived, she noticed how her father seemed to find some comfort in her presence, despite the evident lack of affection with which she treated the girl. Perhaps it was Elizabeth's silence or her efficiency in keeping the house in order that made Gary feel less alone. Barbara was an attentive observer. She noticed the small signs of exhaustion on her father's face, the different tone of voice when he spoke to Elizabeth, and even the nights when he seemed distracted, lost in thought. Although she herself felt the absence of a loving maternal figure, her main concern was always with Gary. He had already faced so much suffering, and the girl felt it was her responsibility to spare him from more problems. He worked hard every day to provide the best for Barbara, and she didn't want to burden him with issues that, in the grand scheme of things, didn't directly affect his life. To Barbara, maintaining this apparent peace was the best way to protect her father. That morning, the day began like any other. Barbara woke up early, carefully made her bed, and went down to the kitchen. Elizabeth was already there, absently stirring a pot while massaging her temples. "Good morning," Barbara said softly, trying not to disturb. Elizabeth muttered something incomprehensible without even looking at the girl. Barbara sat at the table and began eating the bread that was already there, along with a glass of milk. She glanced sideways at her stepmother, who seemed more worn out than usual. "Is everything okay, Elizabeth?" Barbara asked hesitantly. "It's just a headache," Elizabeth replied, more curtly than Barbara had expected. "Don't worry about it." Barbara nodded, finishing her breakfast in silence. She knew that when Elizabeth was like this, the best thing was to say nothing. She got up, washed her plate, and went out to the backyard, where she often spent time watching the plants and the birds that came to visit them. In the middle of the morning, Gary quickly appeared at home to grab a document he had forgotten. Elizabeth was still in the kitchen, now sitting with a tired expression. "Are you okay?" Gary asked as he entered. "You look worn out." "I have a headache and dizziness," Elizabeth replied, sighing, "but I'll be fine." "If you need to rest, rest," Gary suggested, looking for the paper he needed. "You need to take care of yourself too." "Easy for you to say," Elizabeth snapped, her tone making it clear she wasn't interested in advice. "Who's going to do everything around here?" "I can help when I get back from work," Gary said, trying to stay patient. "Or we could ask Barbara to help more too." "Oh, sure," Elizabeth responded sarcastically. "An 11-year-old girl is going to handle everything." Gary sighed, deciding not to prolong the conversation. He found the document, walked over to Barbara, who was playing with some leaves in the yard, and gave her a quick kiss on the forehead. "Take care, okay?" he said. "If you need anything, ask Elizabeth." "Okay, Dad," Barbara replied with a slight smile. With that, he left, leaving stepmother and stepdaughter alone again. Barbara spent the rest of the morning in her room reading a book. Elizabeth, on the other hand, alternated between doing household chores and complaining about how she felt. At lunchtime, Gary returned home. He had brought a special bread his mother had made, already planning to invite them to dinner at her house that evening. "Look what I brought," he said with a smile, placing the bread on the table. "My mom wants to see us tonight. How about we have dinner there?" Elizabeth grimaced and shook her head. "Not today, Gary. I'm not feeling up to it." "It would be good for everyone," Gary insisted, trying to persuade her. "She misses Barbara too." "I already said I'm not feeling well," Elizabeth replied, her tone growing more impatient. "You want me to go like this, with a headache and dizziness?" "You can rest this afternoon and—" Gary began, but was interrupted. "Gary, I already told you, I'm not going!" Elizabeth cut him off, raising her voice. "Why do you insist?" Barbara, who was in the living room, heard the discussion start to intensify. She stayed silent, clutching the book to her chest, unsure of what to do. "You don't need to yell," Gary said, now more seriously. "I'm trying to keep the family together. Don't you understand that?" "If you want to go so badly, take this spoiled girl and go," Elizabeth shot back, crossing her arms with disdain. "Leave me alone with my headache." Gary stopped mid-motion, the keys he held clinking in his hand. He took a deep breath before slowly turning to Elizabeth. His gaze was firm, and his voice, though controlled, carried palpable indignation. "That girl has a name, Elizabeth," Gary said, his tone a mix of disappointment and anger. "Her name is Barbara, and she is my daughter." "Oh, sure. The untouchable Barbara," Elizabeth retorted, now even more irritated. "Always wanting attention, always at the center of everything. Don't you see how you spoil her? That's why she doesn't learn to handle things on her own." "Enough, Elizabeth," Gary responded, raising his voice a little for the first time. "You don't have the right to talk to her like that. Barbara is a child, and all she does is try to live in peace in this house. She's never disrespected you, never complained about anything, even when you treat her with coldness." "Coldness? I do everything for her. I wash, cook, clean, and I'm the ungrateful one?" Elizabeth yelled, taking a few steps toward Gary. "Who else does all this? Because I don't see you quitting your job to stay here doing everything, Gary." "Doing the minimum doesn't give you the right to mistreat her," he retorted, now more firmly. "If you're so tired of being a stepmother, then just say so. But don't use Barbara as a target to vent your frustrations." Elizabeth huffed and turned away, throwing her hands up. "Oh, of course, because you know everything, don't you? You only see her side. I'm the villain, as always." "This has nothing to do with sides," Gary said, his voice quiet but serious. "It's about respect, and you just showed you have none for her." Elizabeth stared at Gary for a moment, her eyes flashing with anger, but she didn't respond. She simply turned back to the kitchen, stomping her feet and muttering something inaudible. Gary took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. When he grabbed his keys and started to leave, Barbara, who had been watching the scene with wide eyes, ran to him at the gate. "Dad," she called hesitantly, "my head itches a lot. I think something's wrong." Gary looked at his daughter, clearly worried, but also visibly in a hurry. He knelt down, took Barbara's small hands, and said with a gentle smile and a funny grimace, "Sweetheart, why don't you try solving it on your own first? Elizabeth's not feeling well today, and she's in a bit of a bad mood." He paused, winking to lighten the mood. "But if you really don't know what to do, talk to her. Even if she's mad, she won't refuse to help you, okay?" Barbara nodded, even though she was uncomfortable with the idea. "Okay, Dad," she answered in a low tone. Gary kissed her forehead quickly before leaving in a hurry, leaving Barbara standing at the gate. When she went back inside, she found Elizabeth again in the kitchen, now with an even more sour expression. After Gary left, Barbara stayed still for a moment, undecided. Her head had been itching for days, but now it seemed worse, as though the tension of the day was affecting her body too. Sitting in the hallway, she ran her fingers through her fine hair, trying to ease the itch. She looked toward the kitchen, where Elizabeth was still. She could hear the muffled sounds of dishes being placed in the sink and the heavy footsteps of her stepmother. Barbara bit her lip. Should I ask for help? Elizabeth was clearly in a bad mood. Her headache seemed to have worsened after the argument with Gary. Plus, Elizabeth always said Barbara should learn to solve things on her own. On the other hand, her dad had asked her to talk to Elizabeth, and the itch didn't seem like something simple to fix. Maybe she's not so mad at me, Barbara thought aloud, but immediately felt her heart race at the thought of Elizabeth's harsh words during the argument. It was as though every word still echoed through the house, spoiled, untouchable, always wanting attention. Barbara shrank at the thought that Elizabeth might say something like that directly to her. She didn't want to cause more problems. But what if it's something serious? What if I have lice or something weird in my hair? Taking a deep breath, Barbara gathered courage and went to the kitchen. Elizabeth was sitting at the table, her elbows on her hands, her head between her fingers, her eyes closed as she rubbed her temples, a glass of water untouched in front of her. "Elizabeth," Barbara began, hesitantly. Her stepmother slowly raised her head and gave Barbara a tired look. "What is it now, Barbara?" she asked, not hiding her irritation. Barbara opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. She felt a lump in her throat, a discomfort blocking her voice. Finally, she forced herself to continue. "My head, it itches a lot. I think something's wrong. Can you help me?" Elizabeth frowned, leaning back in her chair. "Your head itches? And what do you want me to do, huh? Give you a magic medicine?" she asked sarcastically. I don't know," Barbara replied, feeling tears starting to form. I thought maybe you could help me see what it is." Elizabeth snorted, crossing her arms. "Barbara, why don't you solve this yourself? Isn't it enough that I have to do everything in this house? Now I also have to take care of every little itch you feel?" "But Elizabeth, I can't—" Barbara started but was interrupted. You can't, of course you can't," Elizabeth shouted, suddenly standing up, "because you never try. Always asking me for something, always depending on me for everything. You know what? I'm done." Barbara took a step back, her eyes wide. "I just thought you could help me. Sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Sorry, nothing," Elizabeth snapped, walking toward the bathroom with firm steps. Barbara stayed in the kitchen, not knowing what to do. She wanted to run to her room, but she was afraid of disobeying Elizabeth and making the situation worse. A few seconds later, Elizabeth came back, holding something that made Barbara's heart race. A hair clipper. "If your head itches so much, let's solve this once and for all," Elizabeth said, her voice full of anger and impatience. "No, I don't want that," Barbara screamed, backing away a few more steps. "Stay still," Elizabeth ordered, pulling up a chair and turning on the clipper. "It'll be quick and easy. After this, you won't complain anymore." "Please, Elizabeth, don't do this," Barbara begged, tears now flowing freely down her face. "I promise I'll try to fix it on my own. I don't want you to do this." Elizabeth grabbed Barbara's arm, ignoring her protests, and forced her to sit in the chair. "This is for your own good, you'll see," she said, pressing the button on the clipper. The loud noise of the motor filled the air, making Barbara shrink even more. Each pass of the clippers felt like an eternity. Barbara cried silently, her shoulders trembling with every rough movement from Elizabeth. She felt her scalp exposed, the cold metal against her skin, and the sound of the clippers seemed to echo in her head. Elizabeth said nothing else, focusing on finishing the job quickly. When she finally turned off the clipper, Elizabeth dropped it on the table with an exasperated sigh. "There, now you won't complain anymore," she said coldly, not even looking at the girl. Barbara put her hands on her head, feeling the strange and uneven texture of her shaved skin. She looked at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with pain and disbelief, but her stepmother had already turned her back, cleaning the clipper indifferently. Without saying a word, Barbara stood up and ran to her room, the sound of her sobs echoing through the house. She closed the door, threw herself in the corner and hugged her knees as if she could hide from everything. The feeling of the cold wind on her shaved head was a cruel reminder of what had just happened. She wanted her dad to be there. She wanted someone to tell her everything would be okay, but at that moment, she felt completely alone. She spent the rest of the afternoon crying in her room. The pillow was soaked, and her hands still trembled as she tried to wipe away the tears. She felt betrayed, vulnerable and humiliated. As she stared at her reflection in the wardrobe mirror, she hardly recognized herself. Her shaved head was a cruel reminder of everything that had happened. "Why did she do this to me?" she thought, trying to find some justification for what Elizabeth had done. "Is it my fault? Do I bother her that much?" The girl hugged herself, curled up in the corner of the bed, and let her thoughts pile up in her mind. She missed her mother more than ever. In moments like this, she was sure her mom would have protected and cared for her. Gary was wonderful, but Barbara knew he couldn't always be there. Despite everything, she desperately wished he would come home soon. Only her dad could make her feel safe again. Later, Gary parked the car at the entrance of the house. He had had a long and stressful day at work, but the thought of coming home to Barbara cheered him up. He entered, expecting to find her in the living room, where she would normally be watching TV, but the living room was empty. Confused, he went to the garden, where she sometimes played with pebbles or watched the birds. There was no sign of her there either. With his concern growing, Gary went to the kitchen. There was Elizabeth, leaning against the counter, with the same expression of fatigue and irritation she had had in the morning. "Hi," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "Are you feeling better?" Elizabeth muttered something unintelligible and continued stirring the water with a slow and impatient gesture. Gary sighed, giving up on trying to talk. "Where's Barbara?" he asked, looking around. Elizabeth shrugged, still not looking at him. "She's in her room. She's been in there all afternoon." Gary furrowed his brow. In her room? The whole afternoon? He knew his daughter. Barbara wasn't the type to isolate herself like that. "Thanks," he said, his voice more concerned, and walked toward the hallway. When he opened the door to her room, Gary stopped abruptly, his body freezing at the scene. Barbara was sitting on the bed, curled up, her eyes red and swollen from crying so much. But what shocked him was her shaved head. The light shining on her exposed scalp seemed to intensify the pain she was carrying. For a moment, Gary couldn't move, the words failing him. Barbara looked up at him, and seeing him, began to cry even harder. She jumped up impulsively and ran into his arms. Gary hugged her tightly, feeling his daughter's tears soaking his shirt. "Sweetheart, what happened? Who did this to you?" he asked, frantic, kneeling down to her level. Between sobs, Barbara began to tell him everything. She talked about the itching, how she had hesitated before asking Elizabeth for help, and how her stepmother had forced her to sit down and cut her hair against her will. Each word was filled with pain, and Gary listened with clenched fists, his face turning redder with every detail. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Elizabeth had crossed every line. "She said it was for my own good," Barbara concluded, her voice trembling. "But I didn't want it. I begged her to stop." Gary closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain the anger building in his chest like a volcano about to erupt. He hugged Barbara once more, stroking her back. "Sweetheart, listen to me. This will never happen again, I promise. I'll fix this now." Barbara nodded, still sobbing. He helped her sit on the bed and wiped her tears. "Stay here, okay? Don't leave the room until I get back." She nodded, and Gary left the room, closing the door behind him. His heart was racing and his steps were heavy as he walked toward the kitchen. "Elizabeth!" he shouted as soon as he entered the kitchen. His voice was loud and cutting, filling the house like thunder. Elizabeth turned around, startled by his tone. "What now?" she asked, crossing her arms. "What now?" Gary repeated, incredulous. "What now? You shaved my daughter's head. How could you have the nerve to do this to a child?" Elizabeth scoffed, stepping back. "She came complaining about itching. I solved the problem." "Solved the problem?" Gary shouted, his voice rising even more. "You humiliated my daughter. You forced her. You hurt her. This isn't solving anything." "Oh, come on, Gary," Elizabeth retorted with disdain. "This girl is spoiled, always depending on me for everything. Someone needed to teach her a lesson." "Who did teach a lesson?" Gary stepped forward. "You don't have the right to touch her like that. I knew you were cold toward her, but I never thought you were capable of such cruelty." "Cold? Cruelty?" Elizabeth replied, raising her voice. "Who do you think does everything around here? You leave me alone with everything, and then you want me to be loving to this spoiled girl?" "It doesn't justify what you did," Gary snapped, pointing at her. "You knew exactly what you were doing. This was malice, Elizabeth, and I'm not going to let you keep doing this." "Oh, sure," Elizabeth said, bitterly laughing. "It's all my fault, as always. You spoil this girl so much that she thinks the world revolves around her. I'm not to blame for trying to teach her a little discipline." "You didn't teach anything. You just showed that you're incapable of caring for anyone but yourself," Gary said, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "After what you did, there's no going back, Elizabeth. Pack your things and get out of this house right now." Elizabeth's eyes widened, incredulous, and she took a step back. "What? You're kicking me out? Just like that? Gary, you've lost your mind?" "Lost my mind? Elizabeth, you shaved my daughter's head. You humiliated and traumatized her. Don't act like this is normal," Gary shouted, his face red with anger. "I should have realized before what kind of person you are, but now it's too late. There's nothing left to discuss. Leave. You're kicking me out because she whined to you, because finally someone set limits on this girl." Elizabeth exploded, trying to compose herself, but clearly shaken. "After everything I've done for this house, you think you can just throw me out?" Gary laughed without humor, his tone heavy with sarcasm. "Everything you've done for this house. Elizabeth, you've never done anything beyond the basics. And you know what? I put up with your coldness because I thought it was just your way, but hurting my daughter, that goes beyond any excuse." Elizabeth started pacing back and forth, her hands shaking. "You can't do this to me, Gary. I gave up my life to be here, and now you want to throw me on the street. You're being unfair." "Unfair? Unfair was what you did to Barbara," he retorted, pointing toward the girl's room. "You never tried to be good to her, not even a little. And now you come here trying to play the victim. It's over, Elizabeth. Pack your things and leave." "You're an idiot, Gary," she spat, her voice thick with rage. "And you know what? I'll leave. I don't need you or your house. This life here is a hell anyway. I couldn't stand this spoiled girl and your perfect dad act anymore." Gary took a step forward, his expression dark. "Don't waste my time with your insults. Get out of this house before I lose the little patience I have left." Elizabeth, realizing she had no control over the situation anymore, stopped for a moment, took a deep breath and grabbed the bag from the counter. "This will be a relief for me," she said with a bitter laugh. "I don't need to be in this stupid house with you and your whiny daughter." She walked toward the door and turned around one last time, her face twisted with disdain. "You two deserve each other," she said before slamming the door behind her, making the sound echo throughout the house. Gary stood still in the kitchen, feeling the silence slowly return as the anger still burned in his chest. He took a deep breath, rubbed his face with his hands, and walked toward Barbara's room. When he opened the door, he found the girl still sitting on the bed, her eyes swollen from so much crying. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and fear. "She left?" she whispered. "She did, sweetheart," Gary replied, sitting next to her and pulling her into a tight hug. "And she will never come back, I promise." Barbara began to cry again, but this time the sound was one of relief. She felt the warmth and safety of her father's arms, and for the first time that day, she realized everything would be okay. In the following days, Gary did everything he could to restore his daughter's smile. He hired a kind lady, Mrs. Margaret, to help with the housework and take care of Barbara while he worked. Slowly, Barbara's confidence began to return. Her hair grew back slowly, but her father's love and the care of the new helper healed the deeper scars. Gary also became more present. He reserved the evenings to play with Barbara or tell stories, always reinforcing how important she was to him. Father and daughter, united more than ever, overcame that difficult chapter together. Barbara knew that with Gary by her side, she would always have a safe home full of love. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.